This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. This is Novo Bowmana, and welcome again to the Technology Review Council. I am very pleased to have Bonnie Tinder, who is in charge of Raven Intel, back with us again. She has entertained us many times last year, and I'm very pleased that she's here again with another survey that this particular group actually took part in, which I'm very pleased with. So as a result of that, I'm going to turn this over to Bonnie in just a moment, but I want to also remind everyone in the crowd that we're new to the Technology Review Group, recognizing that we are in partnership with the IREM organization. I'm on the board, and I'm very pleased that we're partnering with that organization, the HR technology organization that it is. I'm going to put another screen here. We do provide continuing education credits for the HRIP certification by attending this session. So if for those of you out there effective behind your name, you're going to get some credits for this one. And so from that standpoint, I'm going to turn this over to Bonnie. We're going to have a transition to her presentation, but I can tell you right now, and I've had a little bit of a preview of what Bonnie's survey results look like, that there's some very interesting, and I want to say a little bit surprising perspective. I would ask you all, we're going to hold the questions unless Bonnie asks for them in the middle of the survey. We'll hold the questions to the end. I'll follow the chat box and anybody's asking questions. But I think you're going to be pleased by what you're doing, and we will get a copy of this presentation going out to you guys as well as the recording. So hang in there. All righty. Bonnie, you are on.
Great, thank you so much. And just a quick check, can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Nov, and thank you to everyone who has joined the meeting today. I'm really excited to present really your experience with software implementation and talk a little bit about 10 of the key takeaways that we got based upon a study that we did with this group in August. And just by way of introduction, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my company and how we've worked with TRC to put this together. So Raven Intelligence is a peer review site for enterprise software buyers. So we measure the voice of the customer about software implementation success. And we do this across a variety of HCM platforms. And what we are looking at is not about the software usability or anything like that. What we look specifically at is the effort to get a piece of software live and the partners and consulting done around that process. And so what we did essentially in the work with the TRC is to help uncover those same type of experiences about software implementation in a microcosm here of the group, and to really gather some lessons learned from the over 400 member base that you have of HR professionals and software vendors that make up this community. At the end of the day, the mission behind Raven Intelligence is to really help software customers find the best consulting firms for their software deployment project based upon independent peer review, and to create some transparency in our industry about the outcome of projects. So what exactly did we do in this study? So in August, we conducted a survey with the TRC members in which we asked a series of questions about their experience with a recent software implementation from the previous 24 months, specifically around the time of COVID and around the real intense lockdown period of time, and how that period of time impacted projects and we'll provide some insight there. We had 26 HR practitioners respond and 7 software vendors or software services providers who participated in this study. And we asked 2 different types of questions. So there was 2 surveys that we really had going. For the HR practitioners, those are the ones that, you know, had a project in their company. We asked them about how was the implementation, you know, internally, how was the group that you used potentially externally to help you, and we sort of focused around that versus the software vendors or the service providers. You know, their questions were more about how did you help customers through this same experience. We essentially asked the same type of questions, but catered to the type of audience depending on HR practitioner versus vendor. We compared those answers and put them up against the 1,200 plus vetted customer reviews that we have at Raven Intelligence. So we have customers who review their projects all the time. And so the takeaways and things like that are going to compare the experience of the TRC group in this study against the broader set of data that we have at Raven Intelligence about HR software projects. So number one, a quick thank you. If you participated and spent 5 or 10 minutes providing your feedback, thank you for that, because the great information that you are going to see and your peers are going to see through this presentation is really due to the work that you put in. So first and foremost, thank you. And so now I'm going to jump into the 10 takeaways that we came up with based upon this survey. And number 10. So when Nova and I talked initially about doing this, you know, one of the things that we really wanted to look at was what was the COVID impact of software projects that were in flight. So projects that were happening in Q2 through Q4 of 2020. What happened with them? The answer that kind of surprised us was that it didn't materially impact projects. Most kept going with a short pause. And you know, there's some that have said, oh, well, COVID has accelerated the digital transformation process, which I absolutely would agree with based on what we see in future projects that came as a result of the pandemic. However, those projects that were in flight were paused and now are back on track. So there wasn't a material impact. 43% said no change. 14% of the projects paused and then got scaled back. So after things, you know, opened up and things were a little bit more business as usual, the projects became smaller in nature. 29% of those projects were paused, but then had add-on projects to it. So the project got bigger. And 14%, you know, what we thought would be a little bit higher than it was that projects were accelerated, meaning that, you know, the time frame was to have things done within 6 months, and you know, it got it accelerated to 3. So the 14% of projects had that occur. In general, we asked the question, you know, how long was your software project? And certainly we had some projects that were small and just, you know, the implementation of a learning module or something like that. But in general, the projects that we were looking at and surveying this process had a time frame of 18 months, which is very typical of the projects that we see rated at Raven Intelligence as well. So average project time frame is approximately 18 months. Okay, here's some of the customer challenges and the actual quotes based on HR practitioners who responded. Working remotely has resulted in greater difficulty in settling on design. It was more difficult to show what is possible and discuss the merits of the options. People multitask instead of staying focused on the design sessions. There were problems with connectivity, which impacted the richness and robustness of discussions. Being remote made it very difficult to read body language and hear voice intonations, and to determine if people truly understand and agree with decisions or options. You know, when I read that quote, I personally felt that because I think, and all of us on the line here have some degree of Zoom fatigue. And while there's certain things about remote work that are incredibly attractive and help make things a lot more efficient, help have saved on T&E and all of those things during a project, that's not without its downsides in terms of, you know, being able to keep the project and people, you know, focused on a meeting and being able to really understand, is this person agreeing with this change? Because you know, that was sort of what you know, was sort of the common collective in opinions, or is there something else going on underneath the surface? And so I think this is a very systemic issue and something that a lot of customers felt while their project stayed on track. You know, getting those design sessions productive was really hard. Someone else said key leadership positions had some turnover due to retirements and resignations, and it was hard to get management buy-in and support. So I hear this type of sentiment in some cases. On the flip side, I've also heard some customers say, you know, it's a lot easier to get access to our senior executives because travel has been so minimized. So, you know, there's certainly schools of thought to say, or, you know, experiences that you know, have really had the impact of turnover negatively impact a project, or, you know, the remote work has been a challenge in terms of this. In some other cases, though, it's actually made things more efficient because the availability of an executive, you know, is a little bit better when there's less, when they're traveling less, and certainly taking less vacations. You know, finally, working remotely takes longer to get quality work done because people contracting COVID, our consultants had to work on multiple projects at the same time with different clients because the original consultants assigned to the projects were sick. So there's some very direct impacts of COVID that hopefully we're not going to, you know, feel to that same degree in the future, but certainly that did have an impact, you know, in 2020. So number 9, we asked the question of HR practitioners: how likely would you be to rehire the partner that you used on this software project? And the satisfaction overall with partners was mixed here. Only 20% said that they were going to be highly likely to rehire the partner that they used. And 40% said that they would be likely, but they would still shop around. So 60% had a good experience. A full, though, 40% said that they would be unlikely to rehire their partner. And again, just to reiterate, that the partner being a third-party consulting group that would have been used for the software projects. In some cases, that third-party group is also the software vendor. So the person or the group responsible to help in the implementation is who we're talking about in this case. So what I will tell you is that as I compare this question with the broader set of reviews that we see at Raven Intelligence, I would say that in general, this is a little bit more negative about the likelihood to rehire a partner. We see, you know, probably at least 60% say that they are likely or highly likely to rehire the partner and not to shop around. So I would say that this is less satisfaction with the partners. So here's some customer comments that we got back in this particular area and why they were challenging or negative. So One customer said we were told some systems would communicate that did not in the way that was needed. So there was some integration failure points. My company also expected labor costs to go down because the process and something, because they were making processes more efficient. And it actually went up because the systems did not communicate as anticipated. What I will tell you is, in general, integrations were the most negatively rated area of a software implementation. And that is very aligned to what we also see at Raven Intelligence with our other customer surveys as well. But if there's going to be a failure point, it's really easy for integrations to be that. And another quote in here, the software was only half implemented when I arrived. It seemed like we had no support from the vendor. They had someone with no experience implementing at the company, and new leadership hired a consultant who had little knowledge and seemed to sub it out to someone else. The lessons learned was to get full clarity on scope and exactly what is included in implementation. I would say that this is very typical when we hear of a negative project experience. As I mentioned before, integrations are a big piece of that, but improper scoping that was done on a project, or an improper communication of expectations. What is the box that this project is going to fit in? And what's the time frame that all of this will happen in? Who's doing what? You don't have clarity on that going in. That is where there is going to be dissatisfaction and projects negatively rated. So, and you'll see, in this particular quote in here, that sort of sums it up. So full clarity on scope and what is included in implementation, I would add, and who's doing what. So number 8, the likelihood for a customer to purchase more software. So experience with software vendors was also a mixed bag. Only 29% of the respondents said that they'd be highly likely to purchase more software after their deployment. I would say this also is somewhat negative in comparison to what we see, for Raven Intelligence reviews. 29% said they would be highly likely to purchase more software, 14% likely, 43% said we'll shop around. And here's a customer quote that sort of sums up this area. A good deal of the challenge was due to us. We insisted on deep integration. Not satisfied with the hourly flat files, we reached out to our HRS vendor for assistance, had 3 consultants working with us, and this idea of integration is really a sticky wicket here, and in this case, sort of blaming the software vendor for that. In this case, the software vendors seem to be losing staff by the day, which directly affected the project. Since go live, we've discovered their support team is also less than satisfactory, which we assume is due to losing more staff. So like every other business, software vendors too are plagued with turnover. And when there is a team change, whether it's at the consultant level or at the software vendor level, that is liable to impact the overall success of a project and certainly the overall satisfaction. Number 7, did you get the value that you thought you would in this implementation? So only 1/3 said that they got the full value that was anticipated from the project. A third said they got partial value, and 17% said that they got no value from the project. 15% weren't yet sure whether that was going to have an impact on their business. We only had one respondent who said that the project ended up saving the company money, which I thought was interesting, although not unusual. Some of these look backs on projects are shown not to save hard dollar costs, but enable other options, or not options, but enable more of a digital transformation, the ability to be more innovative, focus on other aspects of the business as opposed to administration, offer new user experiences, etc. Saving money isn't necessarily the biggest value that we see, customers realizing. But in this case, with the TRC, only one respondent said the project ended up saving the company money. So 3 lessons learned from HR practitioners at TRC. Number 1, build in time for delays. Number 2, clean up your data before the project begins. And then number 3, document integration requirements. And along with document integration requirements, I would add, make sure that you understand the scope of the project as well. So here's more customer comments that we got back, as in terms of lessons learned from the customer reviews in here. But as you can see in the second one, make sure the data has been cleaned through and through before conversion. And as they say, garbage in, garbage out. So real important lessons learned in here from the HR practitioner side. Okay, so before we go into now what the vendors survey said, is there, we covered a lot of ground from the HR practitioner side of things. Is there any questions that you've had up until this portion of the report that we can talk through?
So this is Nov. I will definitely and I'll be happy to post them. But let me ask the audience first if there are any particular questions they would like to direct to you, Bonnie. And you can unmute yourself if you'd like to.
Yeah, I have a question though, and forgive me if I missed it earlier, but were these all ERP, EPM implementations? And were these industry specific or size specific of the organization, or was it a variety pack?
It was a variety pack. So this was based on really the TRC composition. So we did ask the industry that the customers were involved with, and it was across the board. I think we had some healthcare, we had manufacturing, so that was a smattering of projects. There were some that were full implementation. So I had a couple of UKG, I had Workday, SAP SuccessFactors, Ceridian in the mix there, but as well as some smaller projects in nature. So a benefits project that I can recall. Another one was just a payroll only implementation. So it was really across the board in terms of the size and scope of the projects. Not enough data points to be able to slice and dice those. We have that in the sort of the larger data set with Raven Intelligence, but this was just based on TRC practitioners.
Great. Kind of indicative of our crowd as a whole. Great. So any other questions that you want to pose to Bonnie? I do have a couple. I'll just make them quick, and you can either say later, no, or whatever. But certainly, I would say that question number 9, this is a wake up to the integrators. Guys, wake up. Bringing talented staff to the table and keeping momentum and promises being held. I hope they hear you clearly, Barney. I think that we are highly dependent on integrators these days. Vendors having good talent, but they know the system. They don't know the nuances of adapting it to business. So integration members are pretty high. I'm curious about your question number 10 about the in-flight projects. Do we have a comparative that was a pre-COVID? In other words, do we have kind of the same mix? Not necessarily that things paused and stopped, but were we really finding that things were shrinking or accelerating under normal circumstances at all? They just did better funding, better understanding, whatever. I'm just curious of that.
So, statistically speaking, we see approximately, and we'll see this on the next slide, 52% of projects come in on time. So that means 48% of projects are late, And, something like, 42% are over budget as well. So I would say during the COVID period of time, there were more projects were late, more projects that potentially went over budget, just because they were, there was more time involved, time and resources. But in general, during the best of times, customers can bank on about a 52% on time rate.
Cool. And I love what you said about the idea of saving money is not the top priority. That shouldn't always be the driver. In fact, hopefully you're leveraging technology to better position you to do more and more innovation, not necessarily just saving money. But you know how that works. Somebody in finance wants to see the money. I'm curious also on your question number 8 about this tied integrations. So the sense that people are not necessarily wishing to buy more software, do you have a feel for the sense that it was, I put in a core system and now it's time to look at the other modules from the vendor. I'm not inclined to look at it. I'm going to go look elsewhere because I didn't like the difficulty in implementing just the core was bad enough. I want to go out and take a look. Is that kind of the sense of what I'm getting out of that question?
I think, these are questions that on the backside of an implementation, how likely are you to purchase more software? If an implementation is negative and fresh in the mind of a customer, they're going to say, we're going to shop around or unlikely, because, it's going to take a while before they're ready to sign up for more pain if the implementation was not positive.
It's a pretty high percentage what drawing my attention. So, and then the last one, which I have to say, I take to heart like crazy. Clean up your data. Clean up the data, please. It's bad enough to move it when it's historically based, but clean up the data before you move the garbage. The old garbage in, garbage out is exactly what we lived through. So, but I like the fact that building in for delays is a very good idea. And to your earlier point, integrations are the most important thing. So get them down on paper. I like that a lot.
And I can't agree more with the build-in time for delays. As I mentioned before, only 52% of projects on average come in on time. So we always tell customers, put a time frame together and then, double it and you'll probably be about right then.
That's good. That's all I had for this portion. So I'm going to let you go back to your presentation, which again is continuing to be entertaining at best.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on. Now we're looking at the sentiment and really the experience of software vendors and and service providers in this group. So not practitioners who work on the customer side, but those who actually help customers implement or sell the software. What I will say that really surprised me in this area is that TRC vendors estimate way more negativity on overall satisfaction during implementation than the actual reviews that we see from Raven Intelligence customers, as well as the reviews that we saw from the TRC HR practitioners as well. So we asked the question, what do you rate the overall satisfaction for customers, customer projects, so customer implementations? And we saw that, in terms of rating on a scale from 1 to 10, vendors say in general, we think that customers, 75 or 80% of the time are going to rate an implementation between 0 and 6. When in actuality, the numbers down below are reflective of what we see. So, approximately, 35% would rate a project a 9 and 10. The vast majority are neutrals and say my implementation was a 7 or 8. And there's certainly, 17 or 18% who are detractors and rate a project a 0 or 6, but definitely not as many as the vendors would estimate. So overall, vendors, you're not that bad. But so in general, the customers are more, in the 7 to 8 range. And I think looking at project ratings, we're something at like a 7.3 out of 10 is our average today. So we asked about what are your average delivery rates, or what would you estimate the average delivery rate to be? As I mentioned before, on time, 56% of projects are on time versus the TRC vendors estimate 41% on time rate. Raven Intelligence averages for on budget around 58%, whereas the TRC vendor budget is 46% on budget. So here again, vendors estimate a little bit lower in delivery rates than an actual customer average, as we see in our project reviews area. I mean, it's not way off, but just in general, here again, a little bit lower than what it is on average. The third takeaway, or number 3 takeaway, vendors estimate a 52% of the time that a team will change during a project versus I had the same team that I started with. And that's almost exact to what we see at Raven Intelligence for our average in terms of the rate of team change. I would say the rate of team change and the project scoping quality are the 2 biggest leading indicators on project success. If a customer doesn't have a team change during the course of a project and their project doesn't have change orders, they are more likely to be satisfied and rate a project highly. In those cases, it doesn't matter if their project was over time or over budget. Those are not as important as did the team change and was it scoped properly. And here the TRC group estimated their changes in team rate at the same level as we see on average. And it looks like there's the question, is the rate of team change increasing now with some of the, and I'm guessing that's the great resignation that's happening, and my pop-up just left there. But I would say absolutely. We are seeing more and more project change right now due to churn within vendors, churn within SIs, and even churn at the customer side of things as well. So it's definitely something to watch, because that has the people dynamics on a project have so much to do with the overall outcome and perceived success of a project, for sure. Great question. So number 2 takeaway, TRC vendors estimate 30% rate of precise scoping, or projects with no change orders. The actual that we see is about 38% of the time have a precise scoping rate. And what we consider precise scoping is that the project itself had no change orders, and that the work that was done was, the work that was quoted was what was actually done on the project itself. So a good 60% of projects, or 62% of projects, actually do have change orders. Not all of those change orders are due to projects that were under bid. A good 33% of the time, customers will say, hey, those change orders are on us because we changed the scope of the project. But in other cases, like almost close to 20% of the time, those 15 to 20%, those change orders are due to projects that, there were things that were missed during the discovery process, and then, customer gets change orders later on, and that, doesn't bode well in terms of overall satisfaction. But here again, the TRC vendor estimate, having perfectly scoped projects, no change orders, the TRC group said 30%, which is fairly close to what we see at Raven Intelligence as well. And then the number one lesson learned, or I'm sorry, the number one sort of takeaway would be, we asked the question, what do you feel the top 3 reasons for failed projects are? And overwhelmingly, number 1 was poor communication of expectations. I want to say that like 60% of the surveys that we got back said this is the number 1 area by far and away. It was always in the top 3, but 60% of the time people said yes, this is the number 1 issue, was poor communication of expectations. Number 2, improper discovery, and number 3, lack of change management. So everything else was, other reasons for failed projects, really these 3 by far and away were the top ones. And you can see in here the comments that we got back from the TRC group that really tie in with this area. The second comment, failed projects are often because the results don't match what people think they should, and it boils down to communications, functionality gaps, and change management. Change management is huge, and if there's not enough that's sort of budgeted for within the project, change management is a real key to success, and making sure a project is well adopted and rolled out properly. Someone else wrote, my top 3 points for failure are requirements are lacking, poor testing, and inadequate executive leadership involvement, leading to poorly defined success criteria that aren't adjusted as the project evolves. And certainly that's a huge area as well. So those are the 10 points in terms of this, in this, the survey that we did with TRC. Now that we are, on the, have gone over the lessons learned from the vendor side, what additional questions do you have?
Okay, I'm going to open it up again to the audience. If we have any particular questions that you'd like to ask of Bonnie. And of course, in the absence of that, I'm going to have a question for you. So I'll see if anyone else wants to jump in, but let me ask a couple of really quick ones here. So the idea of the software integrators that are helping the clients, they seem to be much more harsh on their expectations and such than the actuality. But I'm curious, going back to an earlier question about, did I realize my ROI? I'm curious if there's a way to correlate the client's objectives and being met and the system integrator's ability to help to prioritize that in such a way that those are being met. So in other words, we as a system integrator would know that saving money is a nice objective, but I think really, improving functionality, improving data, analytics, so, and I see the responsibility of the system integrators, despite the fact that they're building the system, is to help the client really understand what are you going to get at the end of the day. Let's be realistic about how you're going to, put the priority of saving money maybe 3rd, 4th, 10th, whatever, and that may help to adjust it maybe a little more dialogue. I'm just curious if you have any data that corroborates that or dispels that.
Well, you would not believe the number of I don't know answers that we get on, were your objectives met and did you save time and money? What were the business impacts of your project? And I think part of that is that there's a lot of internal change throughout a project on the customer side. And so somebody starts the project, and then lo and behold, by the time it's done a year and a half later, I mean, again, these projects are averaging 18 months. the original team, they're long gone. They've either resigned in the great resignation, like Kevin alluded to, or they are in a different job or a different role within the company. So I think it's really challenging to find that information. And I think the other piece of it is that so many teams don't do a post-mortem afterwards, because these projects are so long and ongoing. You get to go live and it's like that's the tip of the iceberg. And so, the idea of doing a postmortem and really looking at your original plan going in and matching that up with reality is so key. But I think the reason that doesn't happen is that it's, number one, it's not a priority, but number two, the teams change both on the customer side and the vendor side. So I wish more people knew that at the back end of the project.
Very good. Very good. On your second question, the scoping, where 30% were precisely scoped and the other 70% were just all over the board, I'm sure. Is there any relationship to the kind of, I'll call it the size of the project? In other words, is it just core stuff? Is it a single, maybe the 30% are the single module that I implement, and the other ones they're way out of scope are the ones that are all over the place in terms of functionality and modules and that?
For sure. The smaller the project, the easier it is to put it in a box. And, and the shorter the project is, the easier it is to make sure that you have your checklist. Where that gets more arduous is when the project, now becomes not just an HCM, but a full ERP in some cases. And, that sort of scope of work is bigger than a broad box. It's one of the things that we always advise clients is eat the elephant one bite at a time, and break your project up into small milestones and statements of work that you can manage easily with a distributed team, knowing that you're going to have multiple in the course of a full rollout if it's a big HCM.
That actually goes back to your earlier question and comment about the post-mortem. The milestones on smaller projects allow you to do several things. In other words, you can realize objectives, which is a nice thing. You can also do a post-mortem and what would you do differently? So now that you go to the next module or next phase, you've got adjustments. So, the idea that when we go live, we're not live, we're just starting our journey. And the adoption, stabilization, all those kind of things are so important for the realization of all the effort that you put in. So I think we kind of cut ourselves short when we say that we're going live and that's where we are, put our stake in the ground. It's just not a smart thing. Last question that I have, and that is the lessons learned. If you don't mind bringing that slide back up, I'd very much appreciate that. That was your question. Sorry, I put you on the spot again.
No, not at all, not at all. Here we go.
That's me all the time. Everybody who's in this crowd probably knows I do that a lot. So I'm very curious about a perspective here. So I'm looking at all this stuff of lessons learned, and I hate to say it, but I don't see the word the software didn't do it. In other words, these are all us, client side. This is things that we could prevent or at least mitigate to a better degree, a better understanding, and things like requirements lacking and so on. I'm curious about a correlation. Again, I'm challenging you sometimes because I'm a information junkie, I guess is the way to look at it. I'm curious about the composition of the teams that are saying we were lacking of requirements. So in other words, I'll have the head of HR and maybe compensation and HRIS in there, and it's a cloud implementation. I don't need IT in there or whatever. All those things. I find that the more inclusive of the team, you get some very interesting perspective of how the use of an HR system really, really works when you get out in the field. It's not an HR system. We are building an workforce information management system HR is a principal user, but so does the rest of their organization. So it's interesting to see how team composition might include people from outside the world of HR and finance and so on, out in the true business. And so I see that being as a continuing problem where we tend to limit who our user population is for contribution requirements. And I'd ask you to ask that question in conjunction with this. What does your team look like? Be interesting.
Well, and it's interesting. You know, so much of the time, the software selection process doesn't necessarily involve the stakeholders or the users of the system. Sometimes, you know, people really try to do that, or they gather the requirements, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know until you start user acceptance testing, and you know, lo and behold, you realize that, well, what managers want in the field doesn't exist within the system that we chose. So being able to have those points of input during the sales process or selection process of software becomes really key, although it doesn't always happen that way.
It's a very good point. I've found, certainly when we do demos, we try very, very hard to say to the vendor, so take a period of time at the end of the demo and show us what we didn't ask for. Because quite often there's something out there that they go, well, we didn't ask for this, but we do this very well. And so you suddenly realize that's either a point of leverage of technology or a point of functionality that I hadn't even thought of. But boy, yes, we could use that. So now, for any vendors who are sitting in our audience for any reason, or listening to the tape later, the recording, quite literally take the opportunity to show them what they didn't ask for, because that's quite often a pretty telling situation. So, do we have any other questions out there?
Yeah, this is Roy. I have a
Oh,
question.
please.
Really just to follow up on what you just asked, Nov, and I'm sorry I came late, so maybe you covered this earlier. But with on-premise systems, you can customize them. And with cloud systems, you can't. And during the vendor demos, it'll look like it can do anything. So, you know, when I do evaluations, I try to see how they would configure or extend their system to do what we customized our on-premise for. But have you gotten any response from people saying, you know, I thought it could do, you know, my weirdo requirement, but it turns out that it can't, and we have to find another solution?
Without a doubt. And we saw that mentioned actually in the, you know, particularly with integrations. So that's one of the things, like we thought it was going to do this. And vendors, I think, pitch integrations as way easier than they actually are. And then also, you know, I think that the vendor support is an issue too that, you know, really disappointed some customers as well. But you know, Roy, I would agree with you. And the you know, the cloud looks like it. Oh, it's, you know, you can customize this or configure it, right? This idea of configurability is good. Or, you know, what vendors will say is the less customization you can do, the better. But on the other hand, you have to make it work for your system, for your particular customer organization as well. So
Yeah.
it's definitely.
Right. And one other question that you probably covered earlier, did anybody talk a lot about not enough time was used consolidating and cleaning up the data?
Oh yeah, for sure. Oh yeah, that was like one of the clean up your data before the project begins. Garbage in, garbage out, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thanks.
So going back to your earlier point, Roy, and I think that's you know, the demos, like I said, the vendors can make that system sometimes do things that they didn't even think they could do. But I think one of the key things in demonstrations that have been eye-opening is to say, so show me the functionality that I've asked for, and now show me how you did it, i.e. that configuration versus I had to tweak it to do this, I had to do that. A lot of the vendors really don't, they're not working with your data, but they understand the function well enough to maybe show you the configuration on how that works. And, you know, as much as we think the configuration is a user-based thing, it's not always that easy as a user configure a system. So those are the kind of, I think those are the kind of things that you end up with a scope change or change order that basically says, I can't do this, I need you to do this. And we end up having a small change to the project.
Yeah. So this is Michael Craig with, I'm with Lamb Research. So thank you, Noah, for inviting me. This is a great topic because this is what we face a lot. Primarily, I'm the PM that tackles most of the global mainstream type of changes. An example of that would be when we did the lease, the reevaluation of our leases per the SEC requirements. So you have to work on a global basis, independent countries, as well as the global aspect of reporting all that up to corporate finance so they can report to the SEC. That's the kind of nature of the projects that I work with. Global in nature, 18 months, typical is one of these projects. Your observations is exactly what we face every day. People get promoted, and that's your AE. Could be a person that was great at the start, but now is reassigned, and your new AE is not up to speed. So that's a fact that we're dealing with a lot here. The length or the longevity of these projects are causing some consternation of delivery on time. Second, more importantly, as noted, people are changing jobs, especially in the software development areas where we have a lot of problems with Microsoft at this point in time, where they can't meet their commitments to us for some of the things that we've asked them to do in their platform that they said they could do. So again, it's not a slam on Microsoft. It's just we are experiencing delays on our projects that are induced by outside influences, not inside influences that we can't control at all. And because of that, it does talk about more planning and dollars up front. But going all the way back to the very start of your observations, Bonnie, one of the things that we've started to notice here is that when we introduce a program, a lot of the people are so busy every day that a non-COVID environment offered the opinion to walk around, catch somebody in the hall, and answer a quick question. Now that takes a half an hour booking a meeting, even though it's only 5 minutes. You're booking that person for a minimum of half an hour to get an answer that is so fundamentally routine when you're walking in the halls that now just take up people's times. And because of that, we see that people's time on their calendars when we're trying to look for booking is just monopolized.
And especially when you need input from non-project team members, the other stakeholders that are not necessarily on the project, but those informal conversations and things like that, there's no more water cooler talk. And so getting and really understanding, is this person just replying my email really quick so they can get rid of me, or like is this input that I need to start scheduling meetings for? It's the virtual environment has reduced that informal communication that's so important to understand.
Very true. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your input. It's right in line with what we're seeing too.
Yeah. Any further questions for Bonnie?
This is Mida. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I have a question, Bonnie. Going back to vendors promising that they could do something. In past implementations, we found that they can do it, but it takes significant customization rather than configuration. Do you get this discussion between customization and configuration quite frequently? Because there's different consequences for cost and long-term maintenance, right?
Absolutely. And it really depends on the software itself as well. Is it, an on-premise? Is it a cloud system? What areas are considered, something custom versus, we can get, through, that with simple workarounds and things like that. So, yeah, I would say there's a lot of gray area in the definition of customization. And documentation, if you go off of what a software is designed to do, is really important, so that you truly understand in a contractual level, what is that configuration going to do, or is it, or not do in some cases.
Yeah. And the other question I have for you is, typically I'm leery of a third-party implementer, and I usually go with the people who own the software to implement, but I've learned that third-party implementation might have some benefits. Do you have people have this discussion in these questions for you? What are the pros and cons of having a third party implement the software rather than the software vendor itself?
Great question, and it depends on what software you're talking about. And I would say third-party implementers, when you choose the right one, can offer a level of process reengineering, functional expertise that a software vendor cannot.
Yeah.
And if you're talking about an SAP, an Oracle, or an enterprise level type of software, typically they're looking to implement through partners versus, doing that professional services work internally. We actually see better rates of delivery when done by a third party than the internal PS organization of a software vendor. So for instance, a software like Workday, their partner scores are higher than the internal PS scores that they have. So in a lot of cases, third-party implementers offer a different perspective that's broader than the software vendors, staff, and PS departments. Yes, you're going to get expertise with the software itself, but you're going to get a lot broader experience set with a third party.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Yeah, and Mita, this is Nov. So I'm going to put a little plug to the software integrators out there, or system integrators. Quite literally, quite often you'll find a client who says, I can't do this process the way the vendor's doing it. We need it to do this. Third party can, if you will, mediate between that. And I've done that myself as a consultant. You ask the client, what about this process can't you live with? And you start discovering that it's pretty much a change management situation as opposed to a software problem. And so, the vendor doesn't want to push on that one. The client really doesn't want to step up to the plate, but the third party can do a pretty good job of mediating.
I think I learned the hard way that there's checks and balances in place when you have a third party. I was very biased against doing that in the beginning because I didn't want to add that layer of complexity. Later, I learned how wrong I was. So yes, I agree.
Good. Well, Bonnie, I need to say thank you very, very much. We're at the hour, and I certainly know that people have got, as Michael said, pretty booked schedules, including those of us who are just sitting around. But anyway, again, as always, thank you for both entertaining us, for treating us to our own survey, and we certainly look forward to bringing you back again as the year progresses, because we're hopefully getting into this, I'll call it post-COVID for whatever it's worth, but whatever we want to call the new normal, as I call it, or the next normal. Yeah, so we will certainly see you again. Again, I'm going to bring up a couple of really quick slides for IREM, because I do want to be able to say to anybody who's out there who is not an IREM member that in partnership with IREM, this will be in our recording, so you can always go back. But it is an HR technology organization really focused on the education of the importance of technology in the HR space. And needless to say, as Bonnie is saying and showing, we all really ought to know a lot more about what technology provides to us. And we certainly have membership benefits. If you're interested, give me a call, because I am on the board. I'm very happy to direct you to the right people. And certainly visit We've got a whole bunch of things. I've got the certification. I have to say it was a very nice education and upbringing to be certified with HR technology simply because it's continuing to change. But I'm going to say to this group, thank you for your participation, because that is what brings our vendors and people like Bonnie to the table to talk to us, because they're getting feedback from us and we're getting some very interesting stuff from them. So again, thank you all very much for your support, and we will see you next Thursday because we have another one coming up. Our calendar is getting pretty full for the end of the year. So again, as always, thank you to all of you, and stay safe, and we'll see you next week. Take care. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.